Welcome to the Homeownership Podcast presented by Momentum Realty, located in Hanover, Massachusetts. This series covers all things real estate and the best practices for buying, selling, and owning properties. Now here's your host, Sean Maloney.
Welcome to episode 142, Understanding Storm Damaged Trees. I'm your host, Sean Patrick Maloney. Thanks for joining me this week. This week I want to jump into understanding why did the storm do what it did to the trees that it did the damage to. So often we walk out as regular people and naive people and say, wow, that was a powerful storm. I can't believe it ripped down this tree, or I can't believe it ripped down that tree. I can tell you as somebody experienced in the tree industry, most of the time, storm damage could have been predicted. Having a certified arborist out to look at your trees is a surefire way to avoid calamity. Making sure that somebody that understands and knows trees comes out and inspects your trees on the regular is a part of being a good homeowner. Believe it or not, one of the most deadly things in the world is tree branches. Why? Because people are out in the yard, they don't expect them, and they come flying down. After a storm like this, even if you think you didn't lose anything, first off, at minimum, make sure you, yourself, your family members all walk around the yard looking up and paying attention to what's up there and what's loose. It only takes a little tiny gust to have that come crashing down on your head, and it will kill somebody. It is a very serious subject, and it's more deadly than most of the other things you can think of, like lightning or bugs or alligators or all the different deadly things that you're scared of. The thing that you should be the most scared of would be branches falling on your head or trees falling on you, and this is a real serious danger. And that's why most of the time they say every 2 to 3 years you should have an arborist by your house, even if it's just a walkthrough. They can take a walk around and they can point out some of the more pressing issues. I can remember as a tree expert, I'd go to people's homes and a lot of times they'd think I'm upselling them on something. Or even recently, I've told neighbors, hey, you should take care of that, and looked back when the wind comes and unfortunately they didn't listen. It's funny that people want to deal with the trees after they're down when they're way less expensive and way less pressing. When you take care of them ahead of time, you're going to save money, you're going to save energy, you're going to save the loss of whatever it is that it fell upon, and the stress, really. That's the worst part of it. Lots of times when we don't have the trees looked at, they can block our own driveway, they can end up on our houses, on our cars, crushing our swing sets, ruining our pools, wrecking fences. So much damage, yet if we had taken it down in a controlled fashion, we wouldn't have had this big problem. With regular maintenance, trees will withstand far more wind. Failure to properly prune trees will lead to bad growth patterns and eventually failures. Having that person out to take a look at the trees, tell you what's going on, see if anything's bad, good, all indifferent, and they're going to tell you where do you need to do some pruning. Because a lot of times the way people prune really isn't pruning at all. Just cutting off the bottom branches or cutting the ends off branches. Yes, is it pruning in essence? Okay, I'll admit that is pruning. But is it good practice? Is it really what a tree wants? Probably not. It's what we want for life, which not always do our two goals align. The tree has one goal, we have another goal. Our goals optimally go ahead of the tree's goals, but the problem is when we leave them in an environment around our homes and around our possessions, and we decide that our goals are more important than theirs, we end up with all different problems. There's a lot of different reasons that, a tree will have an issue during a storm, and one of them would be bad pruning. So let's go through a couple. So a bark inclusion. A bark inclusion is when a tree grows up and it sprouts out into two different leads. And if you think about the V in your hand between your thumb your forefinger, if you tighten it up, you kind of end up with a crevice where your skin is inside. We can both admit naturally if our skin stayed inside that fold the whole entire time, we'd eventually end up with sweat and we'd end up with rotty, kind of gross finger skin in there, and eventually it'd cause some problems like infection. Same thing happens on the tree. The bark wants to be on the outside, so when it grows in too tight, we have what's called a bark inclusion, which eventually leads to rotten bark. In that bark inclusion, that's a perfect place for a tree to snap off. I'm sure a lot of you are looking out at the storm damage you see and probably seeing a bark inclusion. You can usually identify it by kind of a blackish gray, a little slightly brown color up at the top of a very flat piece that snapped off one side or the other side of a tree. Usually bark inclusion. Two dominant leads. This is when two leads go up next to each other. So a tree really wants to have one main lead, most trees, and they want to have everything else what they call subordinate of it, or otherwise known as less tall than it. And when we have two dominant leads, eventually through the whole way that it's kind of like natural selection, it wants to allow one of those leads to fail off. So by subordinating that second dominant lead, we could avoid that through some really good pruning. The next one up will be lion tailing. Lion tailing is when people go in and they prune all the interior wood out. They prune all the low branches off, so all you see are long branches with leaves down out at the far end, acting like a lion tail. And when the wind comes in, it actually ends up blowing through, and that lion tail hits just like a whip, and it keeps slapping back and forth, which is what leads to that branch snapping off. So a lot of times when we think we've done proper pruning, we've actually lion tailed it out. Now upbranching. Upbranching is the act of removing all the lowest branches on the outside of a tree. Well, cosmetically it's nice. For the purpose of parking under it, it's great. Walking, perfect. But if you knew the truth of what goes on with trees is in the woods or in nature, trees are going to bump into each other with each other's branches, and they're going to stop each other from falling over. The other thing is the lowest branches are actually going to hit the ground, and they're going to act just like suspension on a car. They're going to bounce back and forth. They're going to fold because branches fold a little, and they're going to bounce the tree the other way. When it goes the other way, it's going to hit the other low branch. Now think about it. If you had hands below your waist and you were to tip over, your hand could stop you, right? But since your arms are up so high, if you think about wacky, wavy, inflatable tube arm man and you're flinging back and forth, you can't really stop your body until you're too far tipped over that you're already going over if you were a tree. So for the trees, when we get rid of those low branches, they can't really stop themselves from tipping over, which is a huge issue for them. Next one up. This is so common, buried too deep. People all the time want to do what we call mulch mountains in the industry, but that's where you put a flower bed around the base of a tree and you build up dirt on it. What this is going to do is, first off, the outer bark is going to start to rot, which is going to lead to root decay. The root decay is going to lead to easy snapping roots. And what do we see? We'll see the tree tip over. We'll see the tree tip over and look like, wow, it doesn't really have any roots. It almost looks like it went down like a telephone pole. But that's because the whole base has snapped off at this point, which is one of the main reasons that people see these tipped over ones, especially in parking lots like Lowe's or Stop and Shop or any of the large parking lots. That's what you'll see going on there. And then next up is planting trees in the wrong place, like putting them out in an open exposure. Putting a tree that's not meant to get wind at the end of a long field, beginning of a pond, all the different places we know the highest wind's going to be, can lead to a lot of failures. And this happens a lot with landscape plants that people bring in. They're not natural plants growing here. They put them in thinking, okay, I'm going to create a wind barrier, which is great in concept, but they didn't ask the plant's permission to whether that plant wanted to bother holding up the wind for him. The plant says, no, I'm not going to hold that wind up for you, and tips over, ends up perishing. But honestly, what I mean by that is sometimes you got to choose your plants by the area to make sure that they're the right thing for the job at hand. Now let's talk about storm damage. Storm damage is actually one of the most damaging and dangerous times to work in the tree industry. When working on storm damaged trees to clean up brush, think before you cut. Cutting down storm damage can be more dangerous than felling a standing tree based on torsion and the laws of gravity. What do I mean? Well, when you see a tree down, on one end it might be sticking up in the air, the other end might be down on the ground. When I cut that end that's sticking up in the air and I shift the weight, what's going to happen? Sometimes the other end pops up. Sometimes branches set free. Sometimes things snap in other places. These are the things that happen because, remember, all this wood is under some sort of force of gravity, some sort of way of inertia or movement that's going to happen. We cut a branch free that was folded and suddenly the other part snaps back and hits you in the face. These are the things that really happen. A lot of times people trust themselves more with storm damage because they think it's already down than they do with taking down a tree. The truth is, playing with a chainsaw, playing with heavy equipment, playing with any of this stuff is dangerous every day. So make sure if you are out there playing with it, you're respecting it and thinking about what your next move is, thinking about your leg placement, thinking about where everyone else is on the job site, and paying attention to what's really going to happen. If you feel unsafe with it, call out a professional. The truth is, the tree industry is a real industry that can save lives, and the idea of the proper person doing the job that understands what's going to happen. If you need to get tree work done, you better to leave it to the professionals. Over here at Movementum Realty, all of our agents we call Move Mentors because we believe they're a mentor and a guide on both buying, selling the home, but also a third factor, which is owning the home. If you're looking for somebody to give you an expert referral to an expert tree person, reach out to us here at Movementum Realty. We'd be happy to set you up with one of our local referrals. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. I want to make sure you're safe out there. If you haven't already done so, check out our blog, our weekly newsletter, as well as our Facebook group that has all information about buying, selling, and owning homes. Thanks for listening this week, and I look forward to talking to you next week.